When you think of Lebanon, your mind probably drifts to the fragrant cedar forests mentioned in ancient texts, the bustling souks of Beirut, or perhaps the sun-drenched Mediterranean coastline where civilizations have risen and fallen for millennia. But venture just beyond the modern cities, climb into the rugged mountains where morning fog clings to limestone cliffs, and you'll discover something that defies every comfortable narrative we've constructed about the ancient world. Scattered across this compact nation, barely larger than Connecticut, lie stone structures so massive, so precisely engineered, and so impossibly old that they've left archaeologists stammering for explanations. We're talking about megaliths that dwarf Stonehenge, temple foundations built with blocks weighing up to 1,000 tons, and engineering feats that would challenge even our modern construction equipment. These aren't crude piles of rock stacked by primitive hands. These are sophisticated architectural achievements that suggest a level of technical mastery we've barely begun to understand, let alone replicate. Here's what makes Lebanon's ancient megastructures so compelling, so maddeningly mysterious. They sit at the crossroads of everything. This narrow strip of land has witnessed the march of Phoenicians, Egyptians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Crusaders. Each civilization left its mark, building temples, fortresses, and cities atop the ruins of those who came before. But beneath all these layers, older than the oldest written records, lie foundations and stoneworks that whisper of something else entirely, something we've lost. The orthodox archaeological narrative tells us that these structures were built by known civilizations using Bronze Age technology, wooden rollers, and an abundance of human labor. But when you stand before a stone block the size of a modern apartment building, cut with laser-like precision and transported from quarries miles away, that explanation starts to feel uncomfortably thin. The mathematics don't quite add up. The logistics seem impossible. The timeline becomes fuzzy. And the silence from the academic establishment grows louder with each unanswered question. Over the next hour, we're going to journey together through Lebanon's most enigmatic archaeological sites. We'll examine the evidence that's been carefully documented, the theories that have been proposed and then quietly abandoned, and the mysteries that remain stubbornly unsolved despite decades of excavation and study. You'll encounter stories of giant skeletons unearthed and then vanished, inscriptions in unknown scripts that have never been deciphered, and engineering solutions that seem to have emerged fully formed without any developmental arc. We'll explore the possibility that these stones were shaped and moved by techniques we've completely forgotten, or perhaps by cultures whose existence has been erased from our historical timeline. We'll consider the whispered legends preserved in local tradition, tales of giants, divine architects, and antediluvian kingdoms that modern scholarship dismisses as myth. But here's the thing about myths. They often contain kernels of truth, geological memories encoded in story, passed down through generations when writing didn't exist. So keep your mind open as we dig into these mysteries, because the more you learn about Lebanon's ancient megastructures, the more you realize how little we truly know about our own past. The answers aren't in your textbooks. They're buried in the mountains, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the uncomfortable questions. Picture yourself standing in the Qadisha Valley at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight break over the anti-Lebanon mountain range and illuminate the ruins of Baalbek, the crown jewel of Lebanon's unexplained architecture, and perhaps the most controversial archaeological site in the entire Middle East. The Romans called this place Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and they built some of their most magnificent temples here, including the Temple of Jupiter, with its soaring columns that once numbered 54 and stood over 65 feet tall. The Temple of Bacchus, remarkably well preserved, showcases the finest Roman craftsmanship anywhere in the empire, with intricate reliefs and architectural flourishes that still inspire awe. But here's where it gets tricky. Beneath these Roman masterpieces, forming the foundation upon which all subsequent construction was built, lies something far older, and far more mysterious. We're talking about the Trilithon, 3 colossal limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons, positioned precisely side by side at a height of about 20 feet above the ground. Each block measures roughly 64 feet long, 14 feet high, and 12 feet wide. They fit together with such precision that you can barely slide a piece of paper between them, no mortar holding them in place, just pure gravitational physics and geometric perfection. Now, let's be fair to the conventional explanation. Most mainstream archaeologists attribute the Trilithon to the Roman period, suggesting that these blocks were quarried, transported, and lifted into place using the engineering techniques known to have been employed throughout the Roman Empire. Thousands of workers, wooden rollers, bronze tools, elaborate ramp systems, and sheer determination. After all, the Romans were master builders who constructed aqueducts, amphitheaters, and monuments that have survived for 2,000 years. But here's the problem with that comfortable narrative. Even by generous calculations, moving and placing these 800-ton blocks would have required somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 workers operating in perfect coordination, along with engineering infrastructure, pulleys, cranes, ramps, that would have been larger and more complex than anything documented in the entire Roman world. We have detailed accounts of Roman engineering from contemporary historians like Vitruvius and Frontinus. We have archaeological evidence of Roman construction sites throughout the Mediterranean. We know how they built their aqueducts and their Colosseum, but nowhere, not in Egypt, not in Rome itself, not anywhere in the vast territories they controlled, do we find evidence that they ever attempted to move stones of this magnitude. The plot thickens when you venture to the quarry, located about a quarter-mile away from the main Baalbek complex. There, still attached to the bedrock, lies the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a single carved block weighing an estimated 1,000 tons. Next to it, partially excavated in the 1990s and 2000s, are 2 even larger blocks, one weighing approximately 1,200 tons, making it quite possibly the largest worked stone on Earth. These blocks were clearly intended for the Baalbek complex, carved with incredible precision but never transported. You can still see the tool marks in the stone, the systematic grooves where workers, or something, cut through solid limestone with apparent ease. But here's what nobody can explain. Why would the Romans, or any ancient civilization, begin carving blocks they knew they couldn't move? The logistics of transporting the Trilithon already stretched credibility to the breaking point. Starting to carve blocks 50% larger suggests either monumental hubris or knowledge of techniques that have been completely lost to history. Some researchers have proposed that these supermassive blocks were begun by an earlier culture, one that possessed engineering capabilities we haven't yet understood, and that the Romans simply built atop this ancient foundation without ever attempting to replicate the original construction. Local Lebanese legends, passed down through generations long before Roman historians arrived, speak of a race of giants who inhabited the Qadisha Valley in the time, before the great flood that features in so many Middle Eastern traditions. These giants, according to the stories, possessed not only extraordinary physical strength, but also knowledge bestowed by celestial visitors. Divine architects who taught them to move stone as easily as we might move wooden blocks. The Arabic name for Baalbek, Khalat Baalbek, preserves the ancient Semitic connection to Baal, the storm and fertility god worshipped by the Phoenicians and Canaanites. But the legends go deeper, suggesting that this site was sacred long before Baal, long before any recorded religion, marking a place where heaven and earth touched. Dismiss these stories as superstitious myth if you want, but they raise an uncomfortable question. Why did so many ancient peoples, separated by centuries and by vastly different religious systems, consider this specific location to be profoundly sacred? The Romans, the Greeks before them, the Phoenicians before them, and who knows how many forgotten cultures stretching back into the mists of prehistory, all chose this exact spot to build their most important temples. Archaeological excavations beneath the Roman levels have uncovered pottery fragments, tool remnants, and foundation elements that date back to the early Bronze Age, around 2900 to 2300 BCE, pushing the site's occupation back nearly 5,000 years. Some controversial dating methods applied to the massive foundation stones themselves have suggested even greater antiquity, though these findings haven't been widely accepted by mainstream archaeology. The precision of the stone cutting is what truly baffles modern engineers. The blocks aren't roughly hewn and then mortared together. They're cut with perfectly straight edges, right-angle corners accurate to within fractions of a degree, and surface finishes that appear almost polished. Achieving this level of precision in limestone, which is a relatively soft sedimentary rock prone to cracking and irregular fracture patterns, requires either tremendous skill with bronze or iron tools, laboriously rubbing and pecking at the stone for months or years, or some alternative technique we haven't identified. Some researchers have noted that the precision of the Baalbek stones resembles the polygonal masonry found in ancient Peru, where massive blocks were somehow shaped and fitted together like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles, their irregular shapes nonetheless joining with perfect precision. But here's where it gets really interesting. In 1898, a German archaeological expedition led by Otto Puchstein conducted extensive excavations at Baalbek, documenting not just the visible structures, but also testing various foundation elements. In their reports, which have been largely overlooked by subsequent researchers, they noted anomalies in the stratigraphy, the layering of soil and debris that accumulates over time. Specifically, they found evidence suggesting that portions of the massive platform had been covered by significant sedimentary deposits before the Romans arrived, deposits that would typically require thousands of years to accumulate. This implies that the foundation platform might have been ancient even by Roman standards, a relic from a much earlier epoch that the Romans incorporated into their own temple complex. The German team also reported discovering fragments of worked stones deep beneath the foundation level that didn't match any known Roman, Greek, or Phoenician architectural styles. Stones carved with unusual symbols that resembled neither hieroglyphics nor cuneiform, nor any other recognized ancient script. Modern engineering analyses have attempted to recreate the logistics of moving the Trilithon blocks. Even with computer modeling and our understanding of mechanical advantage, friction coefficients, and material stress tolerances, the scenarios required to move 800-ton blocks defy practical implementation. One theory proposes that the stones were transported on a roadway of wooden rollers with thousands of workers pulling in synchronized rhythm. But the calculations show that the wooden rollers would have crushed under the weight, even using the hardest Lebanese cedar. Another theory suggests that the blocks were transported during the rainy season when the ground was muddy, reducing friction. But this introduces the opposite problem. The blocks would have simply sunk into the softened earth. A more recent proposal involves a system of tilting and pivoting, essentially walking the blocks forward by alternately lifting and rotating each edge. This is theoretically possible, but would require extraordinary coordination and would take years to move each block the quarter mile from quarry to temple platform. And even if we solve the transport problem, we still haven't addressed the lifting problem. Placing 800-ton blocks 20 feet in the air with the precision we see at Baalbek would require cranes or lever systems that vastly exceed anything documented in the ancient world. Picture yourself as a Roman engineer arriving at Baalbek in the 1st century CE, tasked with building the grandest temple complex in the eastern provinces. You find these massive stone blocks already in place, forming a platform that speaks of power and permanence. You don't know who placed them there or how. Your engineers marvel at the precision, at the sheer scale. You have no choice but to build your temple on top of this foundation, incorporating it into your design, because attempting to remove or replicate it is simply beyond your capabilities. You write nothing about the original builders in your reports back to Rome because you have no information, only awe and perhaps a whisper of fear at the thought of the power required to command such stones. This scenario, while speculative, fits the archaeological evidence better than many official explanations. It acknowledges the technological gap between what we know the Romans could do and what actually exists at Baalbek. It opens the door to the possibility of a predecessor culture, one that rose and fell before the dawn of recorded history, leaving only their most massive monuments as testament to their existence. We still don't know who first laid the foundation at Baalbek, or what combination of technique and technology allowed them to manipulate such colossal stones with apparent ease. We don't know what happened to their knowledge, or why it wasn't passed down, or whether it was deliberately suppressed or simply forgotten in the chaos of civilizational collapse. The stones remain silent witnesses to capabilities we can observe but not explain, challenging every timeline we've constructed for human technological development. Journey now to the coastal town of Sidon, ancient Sidon, where the Mediterranean waves crash against foundations laid down by the Phoenicians over 3,000 years. Ego. This was one of the great maritime powers of the Bronze Age, a civilization of traders and sailors who established colonies from Cyprus to Carthage to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The Phoenicians gave the world the alphabet, transforming communication and record-keeping across the entire Mediterranean basin. Their purple dye, extracted from thousands of murex snails, became so valuable that only emperors and kings could afford garments colored with Tyrian purple. Their ships, constructed from the legendary cedars of Lebanon, were the most advanced vessels of their time, capable of long-distance voyages that many historians still consider impossible given the technology attributed to that era. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. The Phoenicians didn't emerge from nowhere. They didn't suddenly invent shipbuilding and navigation in a vacuum. Archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that they inherited knowledge, building upon maritime traditions that stretched back into the murky depths of prehistory, to seafaring cultures we haven't fully identified. Excavations in Sidon have revealed harbor installations that date to at least 1800 BCE, possibly earlier, with foundation stones that echo the precision we see at Baalbek, though on a smaller scale. These aren't Roman additions. They predate Roman influence in the region by more than a millennium. What's particularly intriguing is the discovery of unusual anchor stones, massive carved weights with geometric precision that far exceeds functional necessity. Some weigh over 500 pounds, carved from single blocks of limestone with perfectly circular holes for rope attachment and decorative patterns that seem to serve no practical purpose. Why would ancient maritime traders invest such effort into decorating functional objects that would spend most of their existence underwater? One theory suggests these weren't merely anchors, but ceremonial objects, perhaps even ballast for vessels that undertook special voyages, pilgrimages to sacred islands, expeditions to far-off lands, or ritual journeys that combined commerce with religious obligation. In the 1960s and 70s, marine archaeologists exploring the seabed off the coast of Sidon discovered something unexpected: a series of worked stone blocks lying in formation on the ocean floor, roughly 300 feet from the current coastline. The blocks, some weighing several tons, appear to have been positioned deliberately, forming what might have been a breakwater or even the foundation of a structure now submerged. Here's the problem. Sea level in this region has been relatively stable for the past 3,000 years. For these stones to be underwater, either they were placed there intentionally as part of a harbor construction project that seems unnecessarily deep, or they're much older than anyone has officially acknowledged, dating to a period when sea levels were lower, specifically before the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. This is controversial territory, straying far from accepted chronologies, but the stones exist. They're clearly worked by human hands, and nobody has provided a satisfactory explanation for their presence on the seafloor. Local fishermen in Sidon have long spoken of the drowned city, a folk memory preserved in stories told during long nights at sea. According to these accounts, an ancient metropolis once stood where the waves now roll, a city of great learning and immense wealth that was swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic event. Whether earthquake, tsunami, or divine punishment varies with the teller. Modern archaeology dismisses such tales as confused memories of more recent earthquakes or as mythological elaborations with no historical basis. But consider this. Similar stories appear throughout the Mediterranean world. The Greeks told of Atlantis, Plato's detailed account of an advanced maritime civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe. The Egyptians spoke of islands in the Great Green that vanished beneath the waves. The Hebrews recorded the flood, the ultimate deluge that reshaped the world. What if these aren't separate myths but fragmented memories of real events preserved in the collective cultural memory of Mediterranean peoples? Archaeological digs in the old city of Sidon, particularly beneath the castle of St. Louis built by the Crusaders in 1254 CE, have uncovered stratigraphy that tells a complex story of continuous habitation, destruction, and rebuilding. One particularly puzzling discovery from the 1990s involved a cache of ceramic vessels sealed beneath what appeared to be a collapse layer, stones and debris from a violent destruction event. The ceramics showed stylistic elements that didn't match any known Phoenician, Canaanite, or Mesopotamian traditions. They were too sophisticated to be early local ware, showing an understanding of firing temperatures and glazing techniques that shouldn't exist in the 2nd millennium BCE. Yet radiocarbon dating of organic material found with the vessels placed them squarely in the Middle Bronze Age, around 1700 BCE. The excavation team published a brief report noting the anomaly, suggested the vessels might be imports from an unknown trading partner, and then the findings largely disappeared from subsequent literature. You can still find references if you dig through specialized journals, but the uncomfortable questions raised by these ceramics: who made them? What civilization possessed such ceramic technology? Why is there no other evidence of their existence? Have never been satisfactorily addressed. The Phoenicians themselves left few written records about their own origins. Unlike the Egyptians with their obsessive documentation or the Mesopotamians with their cuneiform tablets, Phoenician written material consisted primarily of merchant accounts, shipping manifests, and brief religious dedications. Their histories, their creation myths, their accounts of their ancestors, all of this is lost or was never written down in the first place. What little we know comes from Greek and Roman sources, second-hand accounts written by outsiders who often had political or cultural biases. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded that the Phoenicians claimed to have originated from the shores of the Erythraean Sea, generally interpreted as the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, and that they migrated to the Lebanese coast in the distant past. This migration story has been largely dismissed by modern archaeology, which prefers the model of indigenous development of local populations gradually evolving into the Phoenician culture. But what if Herodotus's account preserves an actual migration event, a movement of peoples from one seafaring culture to establish colonies on the Lebanese coast, bringing with them advanced knowledge of navigation, shipbuilding, and perhaps stone construction techniques? In the hills behind Sidon, there's a site that few tourists ever visit, accessible only by a rough footpath that winds through olive groves and past dry stone walls built by modern farmers atop ancient field boundaries. Here, carved into the living rock, you'll find a series of chambers that have never been adequately explained. They're not tombs. There are no sarcophagi, no burial niches, no funerary inscriptions. They're not water cisterns. The design is all wrong, with no channels for water flow and no waterproofing. They're not storage rooms. There's no evidence of the kind of wear and access patterns you'd expect. These chambers are simply carved, the rock carefully removed to create empty spaces that serve no obvious function. The carving technique is extraordinary, showing the same precision cutting we see in the Baalbek stones, with flat floors, vertical walls, and ceilings that are perfectly horizontal. Some of the chambers feature unusual acoustic properties, amplifying and sustaining certain frequencies while dampening others, suggesting they might have been designed as spaces for ritual sound or music. Local tradition holds that these are giants' caves, dwelling places of the ancient inhabitants who stood twice the height of modern men and who served as guardians of sacred knowledge. Now about those giants. In the early 20th century, during the French Mandate period, several excavations in the Sidon area reportedly uncovered skeletal remains of unusual size. A French anthropologist named Henri Fleisch, who worked extensively in Lebanon from the 1920s through the 1970s, made passing reference in his field notes to remains of exceptional stature found in Phoenician-era burial contexts. These notes mention measurements that would indicate individuals standing over 7 feet tall, possibly as tall as 8 feet. Fleisch was a respected Jesuit priest and prehistorian, not given to sensational claims, yet he apparently saw something that prompted these notes. The skeletal remains, if they ever made it to any museum collection, have not been catalogued or are stored under different classifications. Attempts by independent researchers to locate these specimens have been unsuccessful. This is frustrating because even if we set aside the more extreme claims about giant races, individuals of 7 to 8 feet tall in ancient populations would be anthropologically significant, suggesting either genetic outliers concentrated in specific lineages, perhaps ruling families that practice selective breeding, or nutritional and environmental factors we haven't considered. Picture yourself as a Phoenician merchant captain, standing on the deck of your ship as it cuts through the wine-dark sea. Behind you, the coast of Lebanon recedes, the mountains rising in purple-gray majesty, the snows on their peaks visible even in summer. Before you lies the unknown west, Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, and beyond. You carry in your hold cedar timber, amphoras of wine and olive oil, ingots of bronze, and most precious of all, the purple dye that will pay for your voyage 10 times over. But you also carry something else, something intangible. Knowledge passed down from your father, who learned it from his father, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the first maritime traders who braved these waters. You know how to navigate by the stars, reading Polaris and the constellations with such precision that you can maintain your course even when land is far below the horizon. You know the secret of the double-hulled ship design that makes your vessel faster and more stable than anything your Greek competitors can build. You know which islands have fresh water, which coasts are safe for landing, which currents to avoid, and which to embrace. This knowledge is your inheritance, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, and somewhere in that chain, far back in the beginning, someone made the first voyage, discovered the first route, invented the techniques that your entire civilization depends upon. Who was that first voyager? How did they possess the courage to sail beyond sight of land when no one had done so before? What drove them to explore, to risk everything on the uncertainty of the horizon? The Phoenicians established colonies at Carthage, in modern-day Tunisia, probably around 814 BCE, according to traditional chronology, though some archaeological evidence suggests earlier settlement. They reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco, possibly venturing as far as the Canary Islands. Some historians argue controversially that they may have circumnavigated Africa, a claim based on a report by Herodotus that is usually dismissed, but which contains details that are hard to explain if the voyage never occurred. There are even more fringe theories suggesting Phoenician contact with the Americas, based on certain archaeological anomalies and inscriptions found in North and South America that some researchers interpret as Phoenician writing. Mainstream archaeology rejects these ideas and rightly insists on higher standards of evidence for extraordinary claims. But the question remains, exactly how far did the Phoenicians travel? What coasts did they explore that never made it into any surviving record? They were secretive about their trade routes, deliberately spreading misinformation to protect commercial advantages. When Greek competitors asked about their western routes, Phoenician captains told tales of sea monsters, boiling waters, and edges of the world. How much knowledge was deliberately hidden and then lost when Carthage fell to Rome in 146 BCE and the Phoenician merchant networks collapsed? We still don't know the full extent of Phoenician maritime achievement or how much of their navigational and shipbuilding knowledge was inherited from even earlier seafaring cultures rather than invented by them. We don't know what lies beneath the waters off Sidon, whether those submerged stones mark a harbor that's merely ancient or a settlement that's truly prehistoric. The archaeological establishment has barely begun to explore the Lebanese coast with modern maritime survey technology, leaving countless questions unanswered beneath the waves. Travel inland now, up into the Mount Lebanon range, where villages cling to steep hillsides and the air grows thin and cold. Here, in the region near the town of Byblos, ancient Gebal, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, you'll find megalithic structures scattered across the landscape like pieces of a forgotten puzzle. These aren't the temples and fortifications of Bronze Age cities. These are dolmens, trilithons, and standing stones that predate written history in this region, erected during the Neolithic or Chalcolithic periods between roughly 4500 and 2500 BCE. Some scholars push the dating even earlier into the pre-pottery Neolithic, which would place their construction as far back as 7000 BCE or beyond. These megaliths are Lebanon's least-known archaeological mysteries, overshadowed by the dramatic ruins at Baalbek and the famous Phoenician sites along the coast. Yet they represent a profound enigma, sophisticated stone construction undertaken by peoples we barely understand, for purposes we can only guess at. The dolmens are particularly striking. These are structures composed of upright stone supports topped by a massive capstone, creating a chamber underneath. They dot the mountainsides by the hundreds, possibly thousands. A comprehensive survey has never been completed. Each dolmen required significant effort to construct, quarrying or selecting naturally fractured stones, transporting them to the chosen location, erecting the supports, and somehow lifting the capstone into place. The capstones can weigh several tons, requiring techniques of leverage and possibly ramps or earthworks that were later removed. But here's what makes the Lebanese dolmens particularly intriguing. Many of them are precisely oriented, aligned to cardinal directions or to specific astronomical events such as solstice sunrises. This implies a level of astronomical observation and mathematical understanding that seems out of place in what we generally think of as pre-literate, pre-agricultural societies. Unless, of course, our assumptions about these societies are wrong. Excavations of dolmens in Lebanon have produced frustratingly little material culture. Most were used or reused as burial chambers with skeletal remains and pottery fragments from various periods. But the original construction often dates to a period before these burials, raising the question, what was the original purpose? Were they always intended as tombs, or did they serve some other function that was later forgotten, with subsequent populations adopting them as convenient burial monuments? Some researchers have proposed that dolmens mark territorial boundaries, significant landmarks visible from a distance that delineated the domains of different tribal groups. Others suggest they had astronomical or calendrical functions, serving as observatories where the movements of sun, moon, and stars could be tracked to determine planting seasons or religious festivals. Still others, more controversially, propose that dolmens are evidence of a widespread megalithic culture that spanned from the Atlantic coast of Europe through the Mediterranean and into the Near East, a Neolithic network connected by trade, migration, or shared religious beliefs that motivated these peoples to mark the landscape with similar stone monuments. In the Akkar region of northern Lebanon, near the border with Syria, there's a concentration of megalithic sites that has received almost no archaeological attention. The area is remote, accessible only by rough tracks, and has been politically unstable for decades, making systematic study difficult. But local villagers know the stones, have built their sheepfolds against them, have incorporated them into field walls, and have passed down stories about them. One recurring legend speaks of the first people, a race that inhabited these mountains before the flood, before even the Phoenicians, a people who could communicate with animals and move stones by singing to them. The singing stones motif appears in megalithic folklore worldwide, from the Druids of Britain to the Andean cultures of South America, always describing a technique by which sound, whether music, chanting, or vibration at specific frequencies, could somehow manipulate the physical properties of stone, making it lighter or more malleable. Modern science dismisses this as primitive superstition, yet the stories are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. One particular site in the Akkar region deserves closer attention. It consists of a circular arrangement of standing stones, about 40 feet in diameter, with a larger dolmen structure at the center. The standing stones are roughly dressed, bearing none of the fine carving we see at Baalbek, but their positioning shows clear intentionality and planning. The circle is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, verified by local observers who have watched the sun appear directly over a notch in the eastern mountains on midsummer morning. At the center, the dolmen is unusual in that its capstone has a hole carved through it, approximately 8 inches in diameter, perfectly circular, drilled from top to bottom through 2 feet of solid limestone. How was this hole created? Bronze Age or Neolithic technology gives us limited options. Pecking away at the stone with harder stone tools, using sand as an abrasive while rotating some kind of drill, a process that would take weeks or months of sustained labor. But the hole is perfectly round, perfectly smooth, showing none of the irregularities you'd expect from such a laborious process. It looks frankly like it was made with modern core drilling equipment, which of course is impossible if the monument dates to the Neolithic period. The hole might have served an astronomical function, allowing light or the shadow of the sun to pass through and mark specific dates or times on markers that have since been removed. It might have had a ritual purpose, perhaps as a conduit for offerings, for smoke from sacred fires, or even as a symbolic birth canal in connection with seasonal renewal ceremonies. Local tradition insists that the hole was used to communicate with the underworld, with the spirits of ancestors, or with divine beings who dwelt beneath the mountains. On certain nights, villagers claim strange lights appear above the megalithic circle, hovering and moving in patterns that aren't consistent with any known natural phenomenon. These reports, typically dismissed as mistaken observations of satellites, drones, or atmospheric effects, have been occurring for generations, long before satellites or drones existed, and are documented in French colonial records from the 1920s and 30s. A French military officer stationed in the region wrote in his journal about witnessing luminous orbs above the megaliths, orbs that appeared to respond to the presence of observers, approaching when people gathered and retreating when anyone attempted to approach them. The journal was discovered in French military archives in the 1990s, adding a footnote to the puzzle, but solving nothing. Archaeological work in the area has been limited to surface surveys and a handful of test excavations, none of which have been published in major journals. The finds include lithic tools, flint blades, scrapers, and projectile points that are consistent with Neolithic technology. There are also fragments of pottery that show a puzzling mixture of styles, some resembling early Levantine ceramic traditions, others displaying characteristics more typical of Anatolian or even Mesopotamian pottery from different periods. This suggests either extensive trade networks operating in the Neolithic period, earlier and more sophisticated than usually acknowledged, or population movements that brought together peoples from diverse origins in these Lebanese mountains. One fragment, discovered in 2003 during a rescue excavation ahead of road construction, bore an incised mark that has never been satisfactorily explained. It wasn't cuneiform, wasn't Egyptian hieroglyphics, wasn't Phoenician. It consisted of a series of geometric symbols, circles, spirals, and zigzag lines arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Similar symbols have been found on megaliths in Ireland, Brittany, and Malta, thousands of miles away, dating to roughly the same Neolithic period. The implications are staggering. Either these symbols developed independently in multiple locations, an unlikely coincidence given their complexity and similarity, or there was some form of long-distance contact or cultural diffusion operating in the 4th or 5th millennium BCE, millennia before any historical civilization is known to have existed. Picture yourself as a Neolithic shepherd, guiding your flock through these mountains 5,000 years ago. You were born into a world without writing, without bronze tools, without cities. Your people live in stone and mud brick settlements, perhaps 50 or 100 souls, growing emmer wheat and barley, herding goats and sheep, hunting deer and wild boar in the cedar forests that were far more extensive then. But your people are not ignorant or primitive. You know the movements of the stars, you can predict the seasons, you understand which plants heal and which harm. Your community's shaman, the keeper of sacred knowledge, has told you about the ancestors, the first people who came to these mountains from the east, following the sun, carrying with them seeds and livestock and something else, something intangible, wisdom. The shaman teaches that the stone circles are doorways, places where the boundary between this world and the spirit world grows thin, where the ancestors can be contacted and their guidance sought. Each year at midsummer, the entire community gathers at the circle, lighting fires, singing the old songs, dancing the patterns that have been danced since the beginning. You don't know why you do these things, only that they must be done, that the stones demand it, that the ancestors require it. This is your connection to the deep past, the chain that links you to the very dawn of human settlement in these mountains. Modern genetic studies of Lebanese populations have revealed something unexpected, a deep genetic continuity stretching back thousands of years. DNA extracted from Neolithic skeletal remains in the region shows a close relationship to modern Lebanese populations, suggesting that despite all the invasions, conquests, and population movements recorded in historical times, there's an underlying genetic substrate that has remained remarkably stable. This persistence implies cultural continuity as well, memories and traditions passed down through the generations even as languages changed and empires rose and fell. The megalithic sites, then, aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're monuments that have existed in the landscape for the entire span of human habitation here, witnessed by countless generations who may not have understood their origins, but recognized their importance, maintaining them, incorporating them into their own belief systems, ensuring their survival. We still don't know who erected the megaliths of Mount Lebanon, what astronomical knowledge they possessed, or what beliefs motivated them to invest such enormous labor in creating these monuments. We don't know what the geometric symbols mean, whether they're a primitive form of writing, religious symbols, or maps of astronomical phenomena. The stones stand as they have for millennia, patient and inscrutable, holding their secrets close. Now turn your attention to the archaeological site of Anjar, located in the Qadisha Valley near the modern border with Syria. Unlike the ancient sites we've explored so far, Anjar is relatively recent, an Umayyad trading city built in the early 8th century CE under Caliph Walid I, around 705 to 715 CE. The site features a rectangular walled city with a grid street plan, reflecting the sophistication of early Islamic urban planning. But here's where Anjar becomes relevant to our investigation. The Umayyad builders didn't create their city on virgin ground. They built atop and alongside structures that were already ancient when they arrived, incorporating pre-existing megalithic foundations into their construction. Excavations have revealed that beneath the Islamic levels lie Roman structures, and beneath those, even earlier remains. The lowest levels, partially excavated but never fully studied, contain stonework that appears to predate the Roman period, possibly by centuries or even millennia. What makes Anjar particularly intriguing is a series of carved stones discovered during excavations in the 1950s. These stones bear reliefs and inscriptions that don't fit comfortably into any recognized artistic tradition. They're not Roman. The style is wrong, lacking the naturalism and proportion that characterizes Roman art. They're not Byzantine or Crus-Islamic. The iconography doesn't match. The carvings depict humanoid figures with exaggerated features, elongated heads, large eyes, and bodies that seem almost insectoid. Some researchers have suggested these are stylized representations of local deities or spirits, while others have proposed they might be portraits of actual individuals from populations with distinct physical characteristics. The most controversial interpretation, usually relegated to fringe publications, suggests these carvings represent memories of non-human entities, visitors or inhabitants whose appearance was sufficiently different from ordinary humans to warrant this distinctive artistic treatment. The inscriptions accompanying these reliefs have never been deciphered. They consist of wedge-shaped marks that superficially resemble cuneiform, but don't match any known cuneiform script. Linguistic analysis has been attempted by specialists in ancient Semitic languages, but no consensus has emerged. The symbols don't seem to represent a fully developed writing system with a large vocabulary. There are too few distinct signs. Instead, they might be a limited symbolic language, perhaps recording names, dates, or simple phrases related to the figures depicted. Or they might not be writing at all, but decorative elements or magical symbols intended to protect or empower the structures they adorn. Without a bilingual inscription, something like the Rosetta Stone that provides the same text in both an unknown and a known language, decipherment may be impossible. Local tradition in the Qadisha Valley preserves stories about Anjar that predate Islamic times. These stories speak of a place of healing, where sick and injured people would journey to seek cures from the sacred springs that once flowed there. The springs are mentioned in Roman sources as well, identified as having therapeutic properties, possibly due to mineral content. But the legend suggests the springs were considered sacred long before the Romans, and that structures stood at Anjar from the time of the giants, those same prehistoric inhabitants who appear again and again in Lebanese folklore. The giants, according to these accounts, were healers as well as builders, possessing knowledge of herbs, minerals, and energies that could cure diseases and extend life. After the flood, always after the flood, the giants diminished, their knowledge fragmented and lost, preserved only partially by the human populations that succeeded them. Archaeological work at Anjar has been sporadic and underfunded. The site is overshadowed by more famous Islamic archaeological sites in Syria and Jordan, and Lebanon's political instability has hindered systematic research. The carved stones with their mysterious inscriptions are stored in museum collections in Beirut and Paris, cataloged but largely unstudied. Attempts to apply modern analytical techniques, high-resolution imaging, 3D scanning, chemical analysis of pigments and tool marks have been proposed but not funded. This is the frustrating reality of archaeology in many parts of the world. Countless sites and artifacts waiting to tell their stories, but lacking the resources or political will to properly investigate them. The stones of Anjar remain a tantalizing mystery, suggesting connections to unknown cultures or forgotten historical episodes that don't fit into our established narratives. During the Umayyad period, when Anjar functioned as a trading city, it sat on important commercial routes connecting Damascus to Beirut and controlling access to the Qadisha Valley. Merchants passing through would have seen the ancient stones incorporated into Islamic buildings, visible reminders of the deep antiquity of the site. Some of these merchants, literate men from across the Islamic world, left accounts in Arabic manuscripts describing Anjar as a place of mystery, where the works of the jinn could still be seen, structures too massive for human hands, carved with signs that predated Adam. In Islamic tradition, the jinn are beings of smokeless fire, created before humans, capable of great works, but also prone to rebellion and trickery. Medieval Islamic scholars sometimes attributed pre-Islamic megaliths to the jinn, offering a theological explanation for archaeological remains that seemed impossible by human standards. Whether these scholars actually believed the jinn were responsible, or whether they were using mythological language to describe something they couldn't otherwise explain, remains an open question. Picture yourself walking through Anjar at dusk, the call to prayer echoing from the newly built mosque, merchants closing their shops and rolling up their carpets. You're a trader from Baghdad, educated in the sciences of the age, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and you pride yourself on rational thinking. Yet as you pass by the ancient stones with their strange carvings, you feel an involuntary shiver. The faces on the stones seem to watch you, their oversized eyes following your movement. The inscriptions seem to shift in the fading light, almost forming patterns you could read if you stared long enough. You've heard the whispers, the stories the local people tell, that on certain nights lights appear among the ruins and strange sounds echo, not music, not speech, but something in between. A kind of harmonic resonance that seems to come from the stones themselves. You don't believe in such superstitions, of course. You know the world is governed by natural laws, by the wisdom of Allah operating through physical principles. But still, you hurry your pace as darkness falls, and you're relieved when you reach your lodging and can bar the door behind you. Modern visitors to Anjar are few. The site isn't on the typical tourist circuit, and tensions along the Syrian border have made the area less welcoming to casual travelers. Those who do visit find a hauntingly beautiful ruin, the Umayyad city walls standing largely intact, stone columns marking where shops and houses once stood, the paving stones of the ancient streets still visible. But unless you know what to look for, you'll miss the older elements, the foundations that predate Islam, the carved stones tucked into museum storage or built into later walls where only their edges are visible. You'll miss the traces of the deeper mystery, the layers of occupation and meaning that extend far beyond the 8th century Islamic city. We still don't know what culture created the enigmatic carvings at Anjar, what language their inscriptions represent, or why these particular stones were considered important enough to preserve and incorporate into successive structures over thousands of years. We don't know whether the legends of healing springs and giant healers preserve actual historical memories or are pure mythology. The site waits, partly excavated, partly understood, a palimpsest of human activity with its earliest chapters still unread. Let us venture to the ancient city of Tyre, biblical Sor, another of the great Phoenician port cities that dominated Mediterranean trade in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Tyre was famous throughout the ancient world, mentioned in Egyptian texts, Assyrian annals, and extensively in the Hebrew Bible. It was the birthplace of Princess Jezebel, who married King Ahab of Israel and introduced the worship of Baal, causing religious crisis. It was the city that King Hiram of Tyre allied with Solomon, providing cedar timber and skilled craftsmen for the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem around 960 BCE. The city was built on two distinct areas, the mainland settlement and the island city, located about half a mile offshore, which was considered virtually impregnable due to its defensive position. Alexander the Great, in one of history's most famous sieges, conquered island Tyre in 332 BCE by constructing a massive causeway from the mainland to the island, a feat of engineering that required 7 months and fundamentally altered the geography of the site. The causeway eventually widened with sediment deposition, permanently connecting the island to the mainland. But Alexander's causeway buried something, literally. Beneath the sediments and the stones of the causeway, beneath the accumulated debris of 23 centuries, lie the remains of the original approaches to island Tyre, the harbor works and foundations that predate the Hellenistic period. Underwater archaeology in the waters off Tyre, conducted sporadically since the 1960s, has revealed massive stone blocks forming ancient harbor installations, some of which show construction techniques that don't match standard Phoenician methods. These blocks are larger and more precisely cut than what we typically see in Iron Age construction, more reminiscent of the Cyclopean masonry at sites like Baalbek. Radiocarbon dating of organic material trapped in the harbor installations suggests some sections may date to the Middle Bronze Age, or even earlier, pushing their construction back to perhaps 2000 BCE or beyond. Here's where it gets fascinating. Ancient historians recorded that Tyre claimed extreme antiquity for itself. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Tyre in the 5th century BCE, was told by the priests that their city had been founded 2,300 years earlier, which would place Tyre's founding around 2750 BCE, well into the early Bronze Age. Herodotus was skeptical of such claims, as modern scholars are, but he recorded what he was told. Later historians, including Josephus, repeated similar claims about Tyre's antiquity, citing Phoenician records that unfortunately no longer exist. Either the Phoenicians were exaggerating their city's age for prestige purposes, or they possessed records, oral or written, that genuinely traced their settlement back to the 3rd millennium BCE, far earlier than most textbooks place the emergence of Phoenician civilization. Marine archaeological surveys have also discovered something unexpected: anomalies on the seabed, regular formations that appear artificial, lying in water too deep to be explained by known harbor constructions. These formations were detected using side-scan sonar in the 1990s and have been partially investigated by dive teams. They consist of lines of large stones, some standing upright, others fallen, extending in rough geometric patterns. The depth, about 60 to 90 feet below current sea level, suggests that if these are indeed human constructions, they were built when sea levels were significantly lower. Current geological understanding places Mediterranean sea levels at approximately 60 to 90 feet lower during the last glacial maximum, which ended around 11,700 years ago. The implication is troubling for conventional chronology. These structures, if artificial, would date to the Paleolithic or early Neolithic period, a time when humans in this region were supposed to be hunter-gatherers without the organizational capacity or technological means to construct underwater monuments. The orthodox explanation is that these formations are natural geological features, bedrock formations, sediment deposits, or patterns created by wave action over millennia. This is certainly possible and would be the most parsimonious explanation. But the formations have been inspected by marine geologists who expressed uncertainty, noting that while some elements could be natural, others appear suspiciously regular and possibly modified by human activity. Full excavation would be required to settle the question, but such work is expensive, technically challenging, and politically complicated. Lebanon's waters fall under national jurisdiction, but the region's instability and competing claims make large-scale marine archaeology difficult to organize and fund. So the formations remain, mapped but not definitively explained, one more puzzle in Lebanon's archaeological landscape. Local diving communities in Tyre have their own stories about the deep formations. Divers report an eerie feeling when exploring them, a sense of presence that's hard to articulate. Some have claimed to see architectural elements, right angles, tool marks, even carvings, though these claims haven't been verified by archaeological experts. There are also accounts, harder to dismiss as purely subjective, of unusual acoustic phenomena. Humming or droning sounds heard underwater near the formations, sounds that seem to emanate from the stones themselves or from cavities within them. Sound travels differently underwater, and there are many natural sources of underwater noise, biological, geological, and man-made. But the witnesses insist these sounds are distinct, occurring primarily at dawn and dusk, varying in pitch and intensity in ways that seem almost patterned, almost intentional. In Tyrian mythology, preserved in fragments by Greek and Roman writers, there's a story about the founding of the city. It involves a god, usually identified with Melkart, the Tyrian Heracles, who emerged from the sea carrying blocks of stone and building the first structures on the island. This is typically interpreted as a mythologized memory of the city's founding by Phoenician settlers, with the divine element added for prestige. But what if the myth encodes something else? What if there were structures on the island that predated Phoenician settlement, megalithic remains that the first Phoenician settlers encountered and then incorporated into their own city, attributing them to divine builders because they couldn't imagine how human hands could have created them? This interpretation requires us to accept that Tyre has human occupation, or at least human activity, dating back much further than currently acknowledged, which is controversial but not impossible. The Mediterranean has been a nexus of human activity for far longer than we used to believe, with evidence accumulating for sophisticated seafaring and coastal settlement in the Neolithic period. Picture yourself as a sailor approaching Tyre from the sea in the 13th century BCE, during the height of Phoenician power. The island city rises before you, its walls gleaming white in the sun, painted with murals of ships and sea creatures and the gods. Smoke rises from the Temple of Melkart at the city's center, where sacred fires burn perpetually. Your ship, a merchantman loaded with copper ingots from Cyprus, navigates carefully through the harbor entrance, following markers that guide you between submerged rocks. But you, a sailor all your life, know that some of those rocks aren't natural. They're too regular, too deliberately placed. Your grandfather told you about them, and his grandfather before him, stories passed down through generations of Tyrian sailors, that the island's foundations were laid by the first ones, the ancestors of ancestors, who came from the east when the world was young and the sea was lower. They built in stone that would endure through ages, and upon their foundations your people built Tyre. The priests don't like to talk about the first ones. Such talk complicates the religious narratives, raises questions about the gods that are uncomfortable. So the stories survive among sailors and fishermen, told quietly, remembered faithfully, never written down because the scribes served the priests and the king. Excavations on mainland Tyre have revealed continuous occupation from at least the early Bronze Age, with pottery and architectural remains dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. The stratigraphy is complex, with multiple destruction and rebuilding phases corresponding to known historical events: Egyptian campaigns, Assyrian sieges, Alexander's conquest, Roman construction, Byzantine expansion, Islamic conquest, Crusader fortification, and modern development. Each layer obscures what lies beneath, making it difficult to reach the earliest levels. Where deep soundings have been made, they've encountered bedrock at depths suggesting that the original settlement was on slightly higher ground than today, with millennia of accumulated debris raising the surface level by several meters. This is typical for ancient cities, but it also means that the earliest evidence of human activity is buried beneath tons of later material, accessible only through carefully controlled excavation that has been only partially accomplished. We still don't know the full history of human habitation at Tyre or what lies beneath the waters surrounding the ancient island. We don't know whether the deep stone formations are natural or artificial, or what the strange underwater sounds represent. We don't know how much truth is preserved in the Phoenician claims of extreme antiquity, or how to interpret the myths of divine builders emerging from the sea. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets, and Tyre, with its layers of history built one atop the other, epitomizes the challenge of unraveling Lebanon's archaeological mysteries. Let us finally consider the Qadisha Valley, also known as the Holy Valley, a deep gorge in northern Lebanon that has been a place of refuge and religious significance for millennia. The valley walls, rising over 1,500 feet from the valley floor, are honeycombed with caves, some natural, some carved and expanded by human hands. Christian hermits and monks have inhabited these caves since the earliest days of Christianity, seeking isolation for prayer and contemplation. The valley sheltered Maronite Christians during periods of persecution, serving as a stronghold where communities could survive in relative safety. Today, the Qadisha Valley is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its natural beauty and its concentration of monasteries, hermitages, and churches spanning over 1,000 years of Christian history. But the valley's human history extends far beyond Christianity. Archaeological surveys have identified evidence of occupation dating back to the Neolithic period, with lithic artifacts and pottery fragments found in cave deposits and rock shelters. More intriguingly, some of the caves contain carvings and paintings that predate Christian use, featuring geometric patterns, animal figures, and anthropomorphic shapes that don't fit any recognized artistic tradition. These images have been studied only superficially, partly because accessing them requires technical climbing skills, and partly because the religious communities who inhabit the valley are protective of their sacred sites and sometimes reluctant to allow secular research. The few published studies describe the images as prehistoric, dating them tentatively to the Neolithic or Bronze Age based on style and patina. But without radiocarbon dates or other absolute dating methods, precision is impossible. One cave in particular has generated controversy and speculation. Known locally as the Cave of the Forgotten Ones, it's located high on the valley's northern wall, accessible only by a precarious path that includes sections where iron rungs have been hammered into the rock face. The cave's entrance is narrow, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it opens into a surprisingly large chamber, perhaps 30 feet wide and 20 feet high. The walls of this chamber are covered with carvings, thousands of individual marks, symbols, and figures layered over one another in a dense palimpsest that suggests centuries or even millennia of use. The carvings defy easy interpretation. Some resemble cuneiform signs, others recall Egyptian hieroglyphs, still others seem entirely unique. There are spiral patterns, star maps, human figures with raised arms, animal processions, and geometric grids that might represent counting systems or calendars. The cave was documented in the 1930s by a French archaeologist who spent several days sketching the carvings and attempting to make sense of them. His notes, preserved in French institutional archives, express both excitement and frustration. He recognized elements that seemed to connect to known ancient writing systems, but couldn't find any coherent message or structure. He noted that the carvings appeared to have been made by different hands over a long period, with older, more weathered images overlaid by fresher marks. He speculated that the cave might have served as a teaching site, a place where initiates learned the symbols and their meanings, adding their own marks as part of the learning process. He also noted a peculiar acoustic quality in the cave. Sounds echoed and reverberated in unusual ways, and certain frequencies seemed to resonate, creating a sustained tone that lingered after the source stopped. This suggested to him that the cave might have been used for ritual chanting or music, with the acoustic properties enhancing the ceremonial experience. Local Maronite tradition holds that the Cave of the Forgotten Ones was a place of pilgrimage before Christianity, a site where people came to commune with their ancestors or with divine powers. The Christian hermits who later inhabited the valley avoided the cave, considering it associated with pre-Christian beliefs and possibly demonic forces. But the memory of its importance persisted, encoded in place names and in warnings passed down through generations. Don't enter the cave alone. Don't disturb the carvings. Don't speak too loudly inside, lest you wake something that sleeps. These warnings might be simple superstition, the kind of folklore that naturally accretes around mysterious places. Or they might preserve cultural memories of actual incidents, accidents, illnesses, or psychological experiences that occurred in the cave and were attributed to supernatural causes in the absence of scientific explanations. In 1998, a team of researchers obtained permission to conduct a limited study in the Qadisha Valley, including access to the Cave of the Forgotten Ones. They brought photographic equipment, measuring tools, and a geologist to assess the cave's formation and history. The geologist determined that the cave was natural, formed by water erosion through limestone, and that it had been dry for at least several thousand years, making it suitable for human occupation since the Neolithic period or earlier. The researchers photographed the carvings extensively, noting that while most were relatively shallow, less than a quarter-inch deep, some were quite deeply incised, requiring substantial effort with stone tools. They took samples of patina and rock varnish from the carved surfaces for potential dating, though these samples were never analyzed due to loss of funding. The most interesting finding from this expedition was almost accidental. While testing acoustic properties, one researcher played a flute, a traditional Lebanese wooden instrument. At certain frequencies, the cave seemed to respond, the acoustics amplifying the sound in a way that created harmonic overtones, notes that weren't being played, but emerged from the interaction of the original sound with the cave's geometry. The effect was described as otherworldly and profoundly moving, suggesting that anyone using the cave for ritual purposes would have experienced powerful auditory phenomena that would naturally be interpreted as supernatural or divine communication. Picture yourself as a prehistoric shaman, a spiritual leader for your community living in the Qadisha Valley perhaps 7,000 years ago. Your people hunt gazelles on the plateau above the gorge, gather wild grains and legumes, and are just beginning to experiment with planting seeds and herding wild goats. You, the shaman, are the keeper of knowledge. You know the medicinal plants. You read the omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of stars. You communicate with the ancestors through trance and dreams. The cave is your sacred place, discovered by your predecessor generations ago, recognized as a portal to the spirit world because of the voices that echo from its walls. Not human voices, but the voices of the stones themselves, singing when you chant, responding to your prayers. You add your marks to the cave walls, symbols that represent your visions, your journeys into the spirit realm, your communications with the beings who exist beyond ordinary sight. These symbols are a record, yes, but also a tool. By creating them, you're anchoring spiritual knowledge in physical form, making the invisible visible, giving your people something tangible to connect with the mysteries you perceive. Your successors will add their own marks generation after generation, creating a living text that speaks not through words, but through accumulated meaning, layer upon layer of spiritual experience encoded in stone. Modern visitors to the Qadisha Valley rarely venture to the Cave of the Forgotten Ones. The path is dangerous, especially for those unaccustomed to exposed hiking, and local guides are reluctant to take tourists there out of safety concerns and respect for its sacred status. The few who do make the journey report powerful emotional responses, feelings of awe, sometimes unease, and a sense of deep connection to the past. Some have reported experiencing unusual phenomena, lights, sounds, feelings of presence that they attribute to the cave's history and spiritual significance. Skeptics would explain these experiences as products of suggestion, low light conditions, acoustic oddities, and the natural human tendency to find patterns and meaning in ambiguous stimuli. Both explanations can coexist. The cave might indeed possess unusual physical properties that create sensory experiences, which humans then interpret through the lens of their beliefs and expectations. Archaeological and anthropological study of the Qadisha Valley remains incomplete. The region's religious communities, while welcoming to pilgrims and respectful visitors, remain cautious about research that might challenge traditional narratives or exploit sacred sites for purely academic purposes. This tension between scientific investigation and religious cultural preservation is not unique to Lebanon. It exists everywhere that ancient sites remain spiritually significant to living communities. Finding the balance, conducting research that respects both scientific rigor and cultural sensitivity, is an ongoing challenge. Until that balance is achieved, many of the valley's secrets will remain hidden, the carvings unread, the acoustic mysteries unexplored, the full depth of human occupation and activity unknown. We still don't know who carved the thousands of symbols in the Cave of the Forgotten Ones, what specific beliefs or knowledge they were recording, or why this particular cave was chosen as a sacred site. We don't know how widely the valley was inhabited in prehistoric times, or what relationship existed between the early inhabitants and the later civilizations that we do recognize. The valley keeps its secrets, preserved in stone and silence, waiting for someone with the right combination of skills, resources, and respect to unlock its stories. As we reach the end of our journey through Lebanon's unexplained archaeological mysteries, it's worth stepping back to consider what these sites collectively reveal about the human story and about the limitations of our knowledge. Each location we've explored, Baalbek with its impossible megaliths, Sidon with its drowned secrets, the scattered dolmens of Mount Lebanon, the enigmatic carvings at Anjar, the underwater formations at Tyre, and the sacred caves of Qadisha, presents its own set of questions. But together they point toward a larger truth. History, as we've been taught, is incomplete, a simplified narrative that smooths over discontinuities, ignores inconvenient evidence, and sometimes substitutes speculation for honesty. This isn't necessarily malicious. Archaeologists and historians work with fragmentary evidence, trying to construct coherent narratives from shards of pottery, eroded inscriptions, and structures that have been rebuilt and repurposed countless times. The challenge is immense, and the scholars who dedicate their lives to this work deserve respect for their efforts. But we, as curious humans seeking to understand our origins, also deserve honesty about what is known and what remains mysterious, about where the evidence is solid and where it's merely suggestive. Lebanon's archaeological landscape forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. The first is that human technological capability in the distant past may have been greater than we assume. The precision stone cutting, the massive blocks moved and positioned with apparent ease, the astronomical alignments, the sophisticated engineering, these aren't the products of primitive societies stumbling toward civilization. They suggest knowledge, planning, and technical expertise that we've only recently reclaimed with modern tools and machinery. How did ancient peoples achieve such feats? The standard answers: abundant labor, long timelines, bronze tools, wooden levers, work for some applications, but strain credulity when applied to the largest stones at Baalbek or the submarine constructions at Tyre. Either we're missing something fundamental about ancient technology, techniques that were commonplace then but have been completely forgotten, or we need to revise our timelines, pushing sophisticated engineering capabilities much further back in history. The second uncomfortable possibility is that there were cultures, possibly entire civilizations, that have vanished almost completely from the archaeological record, leaving only their most massive stone monuments as testament to their existence. This isn't as radical as it might sound. We know that preservation is selective and biased. Stone endures, wood rots, monuments survive, daily life vanishes. A civilization that built primarily in wood, or one that existed in areas now underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise, would leave minimal evidence for future archaeologists. We've discovered several such lost civilizations in just the past few decades. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, revealed that Neolithic peoples were building sophisticated ritual centers thousands of years before agriculture was thought to have enabled such projects. The pre-Clovis cultures in the Americas, long dismissed by archaeologists who insisted humans arrived no earlier than 13,000 years ago, have now been confirmed to have been present at least $15,000 to 16,000 years ago, with some evidence suggesting even earlier arrival. Each discovery forces us to revise our timelines and acknowledge that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The third possibility, perhaps the most difficult for Orthodox archaeology to accept, is that the myths and legends preserved in folklore and religious texts might contain more factual information than we credit them with. The stories of giants, of antediluvian kingdoms, of divine architects and lost knowledge, these appear across cultures worldwide with remarkable consistency in their basic themes. Modern scholarship treats these as purely mythological, symbolic narratives that express psychological truths or cultural values but contain no historical facts. Yet many myths have proven to be rooted in reality. The Trojan War, long dismissed as pure legend, was shown to describe real events when Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy. The flood myths found in cultures from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas may preserve memories of actual catastrophic flooding events at the end of the Ice Age when enormous quantities of meltwater were released, causing rapid sea level rise and regional inundations. If these stories contain kernels of truth, what about the others? What if the tales of giants describe encounters with unusually tall populations or even different human subspecies that coexisted with modern humans in the distant past? What if stories of lost civilizations remember actual cultures that thrived and then collapsed, perhaps during the Younger Dryas climate event around 10,800 BCE when temperatures plummeted and remained cold for over a millennium? These aren't fringe theories concocted by sensationalists seeking attention. They're serious questions raised by observant researchers who recognize patterns in the evidence that don't fit comfortably into established models. The problem is that mainstream archaeology has become, in some ways, intellectually conservative, defending paradigms even when anomalous evidence accumulates. This is partly understandable. Science requires rigor and skepticism, a high bar for accepting extraordinary claims. But it can also lead to a dismissive attitude toward anything that challenges the status quo, with inconvenient findings ignored or explained away rather than taken as opportunities to refine or revise theories. The history of science is filled with examples of establishment resistance to new ideas, from continental drift to the impact theory of dinosaur extinction, ideas that were initially ridiculed but eventually accepted as evidence became overwhelming. Lebanon's megastructures and mysteries matter because they're physical evidence that resists easy dismissal. You can stand before the Trilithon at Baalbek, place your hands on stones that weigh 800 tons, and know with absolute certainty that someone, somehow, moved them. You can dive to the formations off Tyre and see the regular patterns that might be natural or might be artificial. You can enter the Cave of the Forgotten Ones and witness thousands of carvings that no one has deciphered. These aren't theoretical debates or abstract interpretations of ambiguous data. They're concrete realities that demand explanation, and the explanations we've been given are, at best, incomplete, and, at worst, inadequate. This doesn't mean we should leap to wild speculation or embrace every alternative theory uncritically. It means we should demand better answers, support more thorough research, and remain open to revising our understanding as new evidence emerges. There's also something profoundly humbling about standing before these ancient monuments. They remind us that we're not the culmination of human history, the pinnacle that all previous generations were climbing toward. We're simply the latest chapter in a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years, a story that includes achievements we've forgotten, knowledge we've lost, and capabilities we're still trying to understand. The ancients who built Baalbek weren't primitive savages. They were humans like us, intelligent, creative, capable of solving complex problems. They faced different challenges, possessed different knowledge, and left behind works that still impress us millennia later. There's a lesson in humility there, a reminder that progress isn't linear, that civilizations rise and fall, and that what we know today might someday be lost, only to be rediscovered by future generations who will wonder at our achievements and puzzle over what we've left behind. Lebanon's megastructures also speak to something universal in the human experience, the desire to create something lasting, to mark our existence in ways that will endure long after we're gone. Every culture that has possessed the means has built monuments, pyramids, temples, cathedrals, skyscrapers. We encode our values, our beliefs, and our aspirations in these structures. The megalith builders of Lebanon, whoever they were doing the same. They were saying, "We were here, we mattered, remember us." And we do remember, even if we've forgotten the specifics, even if we can't decipher the messages they left in carved symbols or architectural alignments. We stand in the spaces they created, walk paths they walked, and feel a connection across the vast gulf of time that separates us. That connection is perhaps the most important discovery of all. Not the answers to technical questions about how stones were moved or structures built, but the recognition of our shared humanity with those who came before. So where do we go from here? The mysteries remain, stubbornly resistant to easy solutions. But that's precisely why they're valuable. They keep us curious, keep us questioning, keep us from settling into complacent certainty about the past. Each generation of researchers brings new tools, new perspectives, and new willingness to challenge old assumptions. Ground-penetrating, radar, LiDAR, satellite imagery, DNA analysis, improved dating techniques. These technologies are revealing archaeological sites and evidence that previous generations missed. The underwater formations at Tyre could be properly surveyed with modern sonar and robotic submersibles. The dolmens of Mount Lebanon could be systematically documented and dated. The carvings in the Qadisha caves could be photographed with high-resolution 3D scanning and analyzed with AI pattern recognition to search for linguistic structures. The Baalbek quarry stones could be examined with advanced material science to understand exactly how they were cut. The political will and funding are the main obstacles, not technical capability. If you've stayed with me through this hour-long exploration, you're clearly someone who values curiosity over comfort, who prefers mysteries over neat conclusions. That's good, because the world is full of mysteries, and Lebanon's ancient megastructures are just one small collection among countless others waiting to be properly investigated. Every culture has left behind puzzles that challenge our understanding. From the Moai of Easter Island to the Nazca lines of Peru, from the stone spheres of Costa Rica to the underwater structures off Japan's Yonaguni coast, from the precision of Egyptian pyramids to the acoustic properties of Stonehenge. Anomalies and unexplained achievements dot the globe, whispering that the story we've been told is incomplete. I encourage you to dig deeper, to read the primary sources, to question the narratives, and to support research that seeks genuine answers rather than defending comfortable paradigms. Visit these sites if you can. Nothing compares to the visceral impact of standing before a 1,000-ton stone and truly comprehending the achievement it represents. Talk to locals, the people whose families have lived in these places for generations, because they preserve oral traditions and observations that academic researchers often overlook. Keep an open but critical mind, willing to consider unconventional ideas but demanding rigorous evidence. The truth about our past, about human capabilities and the rise and fall of civilizations, lies somewhere in the space between dogmatic skepticism and uncritical belief. The stones of Lebanon will still be there, patient and enduring, long after we've all turned to dust. They've waited this long to reveal their secrets. They can wait longer. But wouldn't it be something if our generation, armed with technology and perspective our predecessors lacked, could finally piece together their story? Wouldn't it be remarkable to read the inscriptions, to understand the alignments, to reconstruct the techniques, and in doing so, to reconnect with a chapter of human history that has been lost for millennia? That possibility is within reach if we choose to pursue it with dedication and resources. Keep digging, not just into earth and stone, but into assumptions and certainties that might not be as solid as they appear. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, under the waters carved into cave walls, waiting in museum storage rooms where they've been cataloged but never truly examined. The next great discovery about human history might come from Lebanon, or it might come from somewhere else entirely. But it will come, because curiosity is as fundamental to human nature as the urge to build monuments. We are a species that asks why, that pushes boundaries, that refuses to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are within reach. Lebanon's unexplained archaeological mysteries are an invitation to that quest, a reminder that the past is not dead and buried, but alive in the questions we ask and the answers we seek. The mystery continues, and perhaps that's exactly how it should be.